Does the Bible actually provide the dates for Christ's return and the end of the world? In this study, we're going to learn that God provides 4 important dates that we should know. These dates are based on the sign of the fig tree, that is Israel's rebirth in 1948, and specific time references in the Bible. The 46th year of the fig tree, God's judgment on the church, the 52nd year when we leave the church, and the 70 to 80 years when Judgment Day will come. We begin with the fig tree of 1948. In Matthew 24, verse 32, Jesus commands us to learn the parable of the fig tree. Now learn the parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender, and putteth forth leaves, ye know that summer is nigh. Now, in order to understand what the fig tree represents and why it does not produce fruit in summer, we must go back to the Old Testament, namely Hosea chapter 9 and Jeremiah chapter 8. We begin with verse 10 of Hosea chapter 9. I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness. I saw your fathers as the first ripe in the fig tree at her first time, but they went to Baal Peor and separated themselves unto their shame, and their abominations were according as they loved. When we consider Baal worship throughout the Old Testament, we know that it involves the offering of sacrifices to idols. And these idols represent the works of man's own hands. That is, man's attempt to be made righteous or purified through the works of the law, to include keeping the 10 Commandments, circumcision, and other ethical good works. Sadly, the rabbis in the synagogues fail to realize that the circumcision by which we become right before God is the circumcision of the heart, by which God gives us a new heart and a new spirit so that we can keep his commandments, according to Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 26. Unfortunately, the sign of the fig tree indicates that Israel will continue to reject these truths. As a consequence of this false worship, Jeremiah chapter 8 warns that the fig tree will not produce the fruits of salvation during summer. That is the harvest that comes at the end of the world. We begin in verse 12 of Jeremiah chapter 8. Were they ashamed when they committed abominations? Nay, they were not at all ashamed, neither could they blush. Therefore they shall fall among them that fall in the time of their visitation. They shall be cast down, saith the Lord. I will surely consume them, saith the Lord. There shall be no grapes on the vine, nor figs on the fig tree, and the leaf shall fade, and all the things that I have given them shall pass away from them. And when we skip down to verse 19, God states that these abominations were caused through the worship of graven images. Why have they provoked me to anger with their graven images and with their strange vanities? The harvest is past, the summer has ended, and we are not saved. Now we see clearly why Jesus warned in Matthew chapter 24 that this fig tree would not produce fruit in summer. She did not produce fruit because she committed abominations through the worship of graven images. And as we learned in Revelation chapter 9 verse 20, God considers graven images or the works of our own hands akin to the worship of devils. And when we go back to Matthew chapter 24, we know that the abominations of the fig tree forecast the abomination of desolation that will come upon the New Testament church 46 years later in the year 1994. Are there any verses in the Bible that speak about a period of 46 years that involve judgment on the church or the synagogue? In John chapter 2, verse 20, we read that the temple was in rebuilding for 46 years when Jesus came to cast out the money changers who were buying and selling in the temple, thus making God's house a den of robbers or a den of thieves. And recall, Jesus is quoting Jeremiah chapter 7, where the den of robbers or den of thieves committed abominations through the worship of the images of Baal. But what does that false worship have to do with buying and selling? Well, remember in Revelation chapter 13, we learned some time ago that buying and selling is identified with the worship of the image of the beast, that is Satan. In verse 14 of Revelation 13, we read, "And he deceiveth them that dwell on earth by the means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth, that they should make an image to the beast, which had the wound by a sword and did live." So this language agrees what we've been saying all along about the worship of the images of Baal with regards to false works gospels. Only in this situation, God makes it plainly clear that the worship of the image of the beast, that is Satan, not only involves works gospels, but also false miracles. And that's precisely why we see many signs and wonders in both the synagogues and the churches involving dreams, visions, or even speaking in tongues. And so God simply used the 46 years from 1948 to 1994 to indicate that the New Testament church would also be judged with the abomination of desolation, because she too fell away by teaching we can become saved by our own works. In essence, the 46 years between 1948 and 1994 is the falling away that we read about in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3, where we read that the man of sin, Satan, will be worshipped in the temple of God as God just prior to Christ's return. And so the worship of Satan in the temple of God is the very definition of the abomination of desolation. And so when we go back to Matthew chapter 24, we see that Jesus is speaking of the fig tree as something that we will see shortly before the abomination of desolation is set up. In verse 15 we read, "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand." So Jesus is commanding us to go back to the book of Daniel to understand the abomination of desolation. And when we go back to Daniel chapter 12, verse 11, we discover that the abomination of desolation is associated with the period of 1,290 days. And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. It's no coincidence that we began to learn about the abomination of desolation after we left the church in the year 2000 AD. At that time, we discovered that God is using the day for 1,000 years principle to teach us that the 1,290 days of the abomination of desolation is associated with the period of 1,290 years that began in the year 1877 BC, when Israel was forced out of the land of Canaan into the land of Egypt. And 1,290 years later, in the year 587 BC, the Babylonians destroyed the temple because Israel committed abominations through the worship of graven images. And so the dates of 1877 and 587 BC point to the year 1994 in the sense that they are 3 times 1,290 years from 1877 BC to the year 1994, and there are 2 times 1,290 from the year 587 BC to the year 1994. And so God is simply using 2 catastrophic events in Israel's history to warn us that we too will be forced to leave the church because it is now ruled by Satan, typified as Pharaoh and the king of Babylon. The problem is, the Jews could not leave Egypt or Babylon until God destroyed Pharaoh and the king of Babylon. So too, before we could begin to leave the New Testament church, God had to destroy Satan the Antichrist. We read about the demise of Satan the Antichrist, typified as a little horn, in Daniel chapter 7. So in verse 8, he is referred to as a little horn, and then in verse 11, he is destroyed. I beheld then, because of the voice of the great words which the horn spake, that is the little horn, I beheld even till the beast was slain, and his body destroyed and given to the burning flame. How long did this little horn, Satan the Antichrist, rule over the church? Well, when we go to Daniel chapter 8, we see that the little horn spoken of in verse 9 ruled for a period of 2,300 days, during which time he cast down the truth and the sanctuary. In verse 12 we read, "And an host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and it prospered." In what sense was the truth cast down? Well, the truth is cast down because the pastors, elders, and deacons of the church reject the fact that we are saved by the grace of God through faith, and that faith is not of ourselves, it's a gift of God. In this regard, we are saved by the faith of Christ, not our faith as taught in many churches today. Moreover, Ephesians chapter 1 verse 4 and 2 Timothy chapter 1 verse 9 teaches that God chose us and gave us grace before the world began. And so if anyone is teaching that we can be saved by accepting Jesus, they are committing an abomination, even as Israel committed abominations in that they were trying to become saved by keeping the works of the law. Okay, so now going back to Daniel chapter 8, verse 13, the question is asked how long we will have to endure this desolation in the church. How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden down? And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. And so in Daniel chapter 8, God is simply reminding us that the daily sacrifice was taken away when the 1,290 days of the abomination of desolation were set up. And over the next 2,300 days, that is from 1994 to the year 2000 AD, Satan the Antichrist was able to cast down the sanctuary and the truth, because like the king of Babylon, he was given authority to destroy the temple. But at the end of the 2,300 days, Daniel 8 plainly states that the little horn, Satan the Antichrist, was slain, just like the king of Babylon was slain in Daniel chapter 5. And once the king of Babylon was put out, God's people were able to return to the land of Canaan and Israel to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. So too, once Satan the Antichrist was slain, God's people were able to leave the church, that is, flee to the mountains, and begin to cleanse their temples, that is, to save God's elect who are part of the eternal temple that will become the New Jerusalem after this world is destroyed. Now in Zechariah chapter 14, we also read that after we flee to the mountains, There will be an earthquake, and then Christ will return with all of his saints. In verse 5 we read, "Ye shall flee to the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach unto Azel. Yea, ye shall flee, like ye fled from before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah king of Judah. And the Lord my God shall come, and all the saints with thee." And so this idea of fleeing to the mountains is what we learned about in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, where God says the abomination of desolation is set up in the holy place. And when you see the abomination of desolation, you are to flee to the mountains. Now let's go back to Zechariah chapter 14, because God gives us a time reference with regards to fleeing to the mountains, that is, leaving the church. He says that we flee to the mountains like we did during the days of Uzziah. And we know that King Uzziah reigned for a period of 52 years. And it's quite interesting that there are 52 years from 1948, when God gave us the sign of the fig tree, to the year 2000 AD, when we began to flee to the mountains, that is, leave the church. So what should we expect to happen in the 52nd year? According to Isaiah chapter 6, verse 1, the year that Uzziah died, that is the 52nd year, is when God's people are sent to share the gospel with Israel and the Gentiles of the world right up to the very end. In verse 1 of Isaiah 6 we read, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord sitting upon the throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple." Then skipping down to verse 10, "Make the heart of this people fat, and make their ears heavy, and shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and convert and be healed." Now this passage is quoted in Acts chapter 28, where Paul rebuked the Jewish leaders for rejecting the true gospel. So in verse 17, we see that the Jews, or the chief of the Jews, came together to speak with Paul. And then in verse 27 through 28, we read the same passage that is found in Isaiah chapter 6. "For the heart of this people is waxed gross, and their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes have they closed." And once again, we read that they would not be converted or healed. And so then Paul says in the latter part of the verse, "Be it known therefore unto you, that the salvation of God is sent unto the Gentiles, that they will hear it." But it's also important to note in verse 24 that when Paul first spoke with the Jews, it says that some of them believed. And so it would appear that the year 2000 AD, that is the 52nd year from 1948, is a time when we leave the church, that is, flee to the mountains, in order to take the gospel into the world. Unfortunately, only a remnant of those in the synagogues will be saved. And so now we have two time references in the Bible that show us that the year 1948 is 46 years to 1994 and 52 years to the year 2000 AD. And now we come to the third time reference that also appears to be related to the fig tree of 1948. And this concerns the 70 to 80 years that God reveals in Psalm chapter 90, where we're going to learn that the end of the world will come 70 to 80 years after 1948. The question is this the generation that God warned about in Matthew chapter 24, where he says that the generation that sees the fig tree come in leaf will not pass away until all the things are fulfilled that are written in Matthew chapter 24? So let's begin in Psalm chapter 90, verse 5, where God warns that trees that wither like the fig tree will be cut down. Thou carriest them away as with a flood. They are as a sleep. In the morning they are like grass which groweth up. In the morning they flourish and groweth up. In the evening it is cut down and withered. For we are consumed by thy anger, and by thy wrath are we troubled. Now when we consider the words morning and wither, we are reminded of Matthew chapter 21 verse 18, where Jesus came looking for fruit on the fig tree in the morning, and after finding none, the tree withered away. Now in the morning, as he returned unto the city, he hungered. And when he saw a fig tree in the way, he came to it, and found nothing thereof but leaves only, and said unto it, Let no fruit grow on thee henceforward forever. And presently the fig tree withered away. But when we return back to Psalm chapter 90, we discover that God gave the fig tree or the trees 70 to 80 years to grow before being cut down. For the days of our years are 80 years and 10, and if by reason of strength they be 80 years, yet is their strength labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off, and we fly away. The phrase fly away simply refers to the fact that God's elect who produce fruit will be raptured on the last day. These are the saints that we read about in Zechariah chapter 14, where God says that we will flee to the mountains, and then Christ will come with all of his saints. However, if we do not produce fruits, God is warning that we will be cut down like the fig tree. And we know that those trees that do not produce fruit are identified with untimely figs, spoken of in Revelation chapter 6. In verse 12 we read, And I beheld, when he opened up the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became as black as hair, and the moon became as blood. And the stars of heaven fell unto the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs when she is shaken of a mighty wind. Clearly, God is using the fig tree to demonstrate that the synagogues will not produce fruit when we come to the time of the end, which could be 70 to 80 years after 1948. But in the meantime, God says that we will have strength as we labor. And we know from Luke chapter 13, verses 8 through 9, that the laboring that we do for the fig tree involves digging and dunging it in hopes that it will eventually bear fruit. In other words, the digging and the dunging have everything to do with taking the gospel to the fig tree that is Israel, as well as all the trees, that is the peoples of the world, as we read in Luke 21, verse 29. And he spake to them a parable. Behold the fig tree and all the trees. When they now shoot forth, ye see and know of your own selves that summer is now nigh at hand. So likewise ye, when ye see these things come to pass, know ye that the kingdom of God is nigh at hand. Verily I say unto you, this generation, that is the generation of 70 to 80 years, shall not pass away till all be fulfilled. In this respect, God promises in Matthew chapter 24, verse 14, that this gospel will go into all nations as a witness, and then the end will come. And so as we take the gospel into the world, we warn those in the synagogues and the churches to turn away from trying to become saved by the works of their own hands, which are typified as the worship of graven images or the worship of devils. Moreover, God warns that we must not seek after signs and wonders, such as dreams, visions, or speaking in tongues. All of these manifestations are Satan, who comes as an angel of light and its ministers as ministers of righteousness. If we recognize that we're not a child of God, we must cry to God for mercy as did the publican and the thief on the cross, all the while knowing that John chapter 6 verse 44 teaches that we cannot come to Jesus unless the Father draws us. Nonetheless, Lamentations chapter 3 verse 26 reveals that we must quietly wait for the salvation of the Lord.